All right, everybody, welcome to the NATA webinar, Implementing FAA Pilot Exemptions for Part 135 Operations. For today's webinar, all the attendees are muted. If you are logging in on a PC, you can dock and reopen the interface to give yourself a little bit more room using that orange arrow. We will have time for questions at the end, and you have two ways of asking questions. You can either raise your hand, and I'll be able to unmute you at the right time so you can ask a question, or you can use the text box to type in a question at any time, and it'll be saved in the queue here, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. Finally, handouts are available. Please be sure to download them before the webinar ends. Handouts include copies of the relevant FAA exemptions and a copy of these presentation slides. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to the NATA website. I am Jackie Rosser. Thank you for joining us. I will be your moderator today, and joining me are John McGraw and Keith DeBerry. To begin, John McGraw will give us an overview of what has been happening at the FAA. I'll turn it over to John.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to give you I think things are obviously in this unprecedented time are changing pretty quickly. So I want to give you an update of the activities that we have underway and what we believe is coming from FAA. We have been talking to the leadership in aviation safety, the entire leadership team, every week to get the status of the mitigations that we've asked for to help in a time where the FAA can't respond like we would like. This week's update on Wednesday, we talked to the FAA about a long list of requests that we have in, and the FAA is working on one single set of rulemaking that we believe will accommodate most, if not all, of the requests we've made to them for relief. The other thing the FAA is doing is they have a point of contact where we can reach them and try to help if there's a case that isn't covered by either the exemptions or by the upcoming rulemaking, which is likely to be an SFAR. And we think we'll see the upcoming rulemaking. It could be as soon as a week or week and a half, probably more like 2 weeks before that is out, just because of the scope and breadth of the rulemaking. So more to come. We pushed very hard up front to get the exemptions we have, and we're still pushing. FAA, I have to say, has been very cooperative. They're going 24/7 trying to get this stuff through, and in government terms, it's moving at light speed, which is slower than everybody wants, but faster than normal. So I'm very hopeful that they'll cover all of the requests we have. What Keith is going to present here in a few minutes is really important information. You'll notice in the two exemptions that are out for 135 that there's a requirement for assessing risk. And I'll just tell you, philosophically, the FAA is going to increasingly look to operators to determine what kind of risk they're taking and whether it's acceptable or not. And this is sort of the first step of that process. The exemptions, I don't think they anticipated making it a really difficult process. They really just wanted operators to think through the risk that could exist, if any, as a result of extending some of these deadlines. If you have a problem where you've submitted something that you believe is satisfactory and follows today's guidance, and you have a problem with a POI that doesn't accept it or starts to get, having difficulty coming to closure on what should be expected, please let us know, because the FAA is also interested in making sure that they don't slow down people taking advantage of this exemption if they're actually following the terms of the exemption. So we'll be glad to help out in that case. I will tell you, in the future, this is my last point. In the future, as this SFAR comes out, I would expect to see requirements for this kind of risk management, safety management process in the upcoming SFAR as well, and it may be for things that require a lot more work than this probably will. So with that being said, let me turn it over to Keith, and we can take questions at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, John. Thanks, Jackie. So there are two exemptions out currently, 18509 and 18510. We're going to use 18510, which is the exemption around checks and proficiency rides. So basically, looking at the exemption, it says basically that it's going to exempt only crew members and ground personnel who are required to complete reoccurring training by May the 31st, 2020. So the rule has a 1 month grace period. The exemption gives you 2 additional months for a total of about 90 days to do that. So I guess the first step would be, and I've talked to multiple operators, 135 operators, the first thing they have done is they've identified who that pool of crew members that will require training through May the 31st. So if you are going to use this exemption, you have crew members and they're going to need to be utilized in flight operations. Probably the FAA Principal Operations Inspector is going to want to know who they are, and they're going to want to know what the safety risk assessment is if you're going to use them. And if you have an accepted SMS, and there are a few 135 operators out there that have an accepted SMS, of course, they'll be looking for a safety risk assessment in a very formal way, much like a Part 5 121 carrier would use. And if you don't, they're going to ask for a safety analysis and corresponding risk mitigation. So at the end of the day, they're going to be looking for risk mitigations that if you're going to use the exemption, and you're going to need to be in compliant with 135.329E1, which is basically around crew training. So those are the things they're going to be looking for. Typical POIs are not going to amend OPSPEC A005 until that plan has been submitted to them for their acceptance, and you guys have kind of worked through that. So those are the boundaries of what we're going to work with. So next slide, please. So at the end of the day, this safety risk assessment, safety risk analysis kind of falls under the umbrella of safety risk management. And all safety risk management is a defined process, your process that you've worked through your POIs with on how to look at something, look at a system and identify hazards, come up with some kind of analysis of that hazard, and then perform some kind of risk assessment on that and come up with some kind of mitigation process and reach into an acceptable level of risk. Next slide. Thank you. So these are triggers that's when to use safety risk management. And I will tell you, there is a lot of effort going on right now under a 135 rulemaking process to implement safety management systems for 135 and 145 repair stations. So these are the things that the FAA would be looking at to when an operator or certificate holder would actually apply or perform safety risk management. So if you implement a new system, you revise an existing system, develop some kind of new operational procedures or controls, and then coming out of the safety assurance, which is the oversight of the system itself, through multiple venues of data collection, and you identify some new hazard, they're going to be looking for what safety risk management process did you put into place in that. So using this exemption, you can maybe pick a couple out. Some of the operators use 3 of these particular things to apply safety risk management. They implemented a new system. They did revise their existing system around crew tracking, those kinds of things. So there's something new that went into place. Operational procedures, how are they going to contend with people or crew members who have not had currency training or a recheck or a level set. And by the way, these requirements are federally mandated, federal aviation rules, which are a risk control in themselves. So these are the triggers or the causes to do safety risk management. Next, please. Thank you. So in order to do safety risk management, you have to basically understand the system and the environment. The beauty of this is the system and the environment is controlled by the certificate holder and the operator, not necessarily the FAA. No one knows your system, your process, your procedures, your manuals like you do. So you're strategically positioned to identify those conditions and assess that risk and apply some kind of risk controls, risk mitigations. And there's a lot of things that controls, like federal aviation rules and regulations are a control, training is a control or a risk control. So there's multiple things that can be put into place to do that. Next, please. So there's lots and lots of risk, lots and lots of hazards with elevated risk around operation of airplanes. So we're going to focus on those that pose the greatest threat. So in this particular instance, around 18.510, the greatest or the hazard would be loss of proficiency or perceived loss of proficiency because of the lack of training or check that's required by the Federal Aviation Regulation. So when doing safety risk management, you have to basically balance your decisions between assessed risk and viable risk mitigation. The way to mitigate risk to zero is to stop flying, but financially, that'll kill you. So you don't want to do that. You want to continue to fly, but you want to continue to fly and make decisions predicated on lowering the risk to the acceptable level or a acceptable level. Next slide. So hazard, people continue to use the terms hazard and risk synonymously, and really they're two different things. You can't have risk without hazard. And a hazard is any real or potential condition. So for example, in this 18.510, this exemption, there is a potential risk. A potential risk could be pairing two crew members or multiple crew members together that are overdue or coming up due on their currency or their check rides. So you have to think about through those kinds of things. It's potential. It hasn't happened, but there's something that could happen from that. So anything that can result in injury, death to people, damage to equipment, or the operating environment. Next. But remember, you have to have hazards before you can have risk. So hazard identification, the certificate holder, the operator, is uniquely positioned to have the operational expertise in their particular system. So they are uniquely positioned. They're the ones that should be able to come down to what is a hazard and what are the risks of that. So not only operational experience, but you need some kind of training or experience. And I'm sure that a lot of the DOs out there have a lot of operational experience in hazard identification. And there needs to be some kind of tool. And it doesn't need to be a complicated tool. I've seen everything over the past couple of weeks from a spreadsheet to a computer program that is used for hazard analysis tools. Next, please. So after you've done your hazard identification, you're going to be looking at what's the potential of the likelihood of that failure to occur. And this is a way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. I've seen 5x5 charts. I've seen 6x6 charts. I've seen all kinds of things. It's your decision or your preference on how you want to use a particular likelihood and severity matrix. And we'll get to that later on in the next couple of slides. But when you're looking at an active failure, the likelihood is it, frequent, occasional, remote, improbable, extremely improbable. We have had multiple discussions around, what is frequent, what is remote. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. And at the end of the day, this is your system, it's your processes. And if you can basically defend that, and I will tell you that the industry probably knows a lot more about safety risk management than the collective FAA does right now. There's been a major emphasis toward training 121 principals and FAA inspectors. So the next wave is coming. So if your process, ever how you want to do that, ever how you want to present that, I think the FAA up 135 POIs are going to be open to that. Next slide, please. So after you look at the likelihood, is it going to happen? Could it happen? How often it's going to happen? If it does happen, how bad is it going to hurt? Or how bad is it going to be? Is it going to be catastrophic? You know, you damage equipment, multiple deaths. Is it hazardous? And these, again, this is a way to do it, but not the only way to do it. Next slide, please. So, to distinguish between a hazard, active failure, consequence, risk, the likelihood and severity of the consequence. So you have to distinguish between the two. In order to have risk, you have to have hazards. And if you have hazards and you have risk, there are some consequences or perceived consequences of the result of letting that go without mitigation. So there will be a decision. So the person making the decision on what the mitigation strategy is the responsible person. And it needs to be the responsible person forever who has the responsibility of that particular operation. Next, please. So here's a risk chart put together. Again, this is a way to do it, but not the only way to do it, where it combines risk likelihood and risk severity. So as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, if it's going to be catastrophic in severity and frequent, it's 5A, it's probably not acceptable. What you're trying to get to in mitigation strategies is down to the far right side of the chart as much as you possibly can by putting mitigations into place. Some mitigations will not be able to be taken into the green, but will be in the yellow. That's where it's really important when you start to look at who's going to accept that risk for the certificate. And what we found in working with a lot of the certificate holders, where they were actually, people were taking or accepting the risk that was not in a position to accept that risk. And the senior leadership in that particular certificate or operation didn't even know that that risk was being accepted. So that's really an important point. And that was some of the things that was discovered and we got smarter about as we went along with safety management system development and implementation. Next, please. So again, this is a way to do it, but not the only way to do it. And these are just definitions. And if you use something like this, the definitions are already kind of described and explained. You just have to come to terms on what your particular operation, what works the best for you. But the definitions and the words we use are really, really important around acceptable with mitigation, and then completely unacceptable, and who's going to accept that risk if it is acceptable with mitigation. Next, please. So this is what we're going to provide the FAA, and I would assume that the majority of the principals are going to be looking for, yes, we're going to use this exemption. We want A005 in the OPSPEC amended, saying that we're going to use this exemption. Who is going to be exempted, and what's the plan? What's the mitigation strategy that the certificate holder or the owner of the process is going to put into place to mitigate the risk of those particular crew members not receiving the required annual or biannual or semi-annual certification, check, surveillance kind of thing. So the documentation comes in many, many, many forms. But these are some of the recommended procedures that you put into place when you do have a risk acceptance process. Who is that person that's going to accept that? You look at some kind of procedures, written procedures. I'm sure the FAA is going to be looking at that before they amend OPSPEC A005. And that risk assessment is pretty straightforward, and we'll look at that next. The key to it is who's going to accept that risk for the company. Next, please. So this is a takeoff of one 135 operator, a colleague that has actually went through the safety risk analysis and assessment. They had more of a defined safety management system in place with defined safety risk management and safety assurance processes. And basically, they kind of captured what the event or the issue or the hazard itself pretty straightforward. And by the way, this was accepted by the POI for this particular operator. So one of the things they came up with, and this is really the crux of everything, is decreased crew member proficiency due to extended time between training and checks. So what are those mitigations? What strategies, what process procedure, what things are you going to put into place to ensure that those members who have not received that required check to assuring compliance of 135.329E1? And then there were some other things that they actually came up with. Crew members unaware of current status or additional grace months. So it's communication to the crews themselves. Possibility of assignment of 2 crew members who are out of currency. What mitigation or what strategy you're going to put into place if you perceive that as a risk. And then how are you going to? This particular operator had a electronic system that managed its crew training and tracking, and everything would turn magenta if it was coming up due. So how are they going to manage that to ensure that, they didn't fall through the crack? And then the recovery strategy is, once we're through this and we can go back to some semblance of normalcy in training, how we're going to make sure that those people are the first in line to get trained and recertified and requalified and brought up to speed. Again, this is an example. It's not the only way to do it. As I said earlier in the presentation, I've seen everything from, something very, very, very simple on a spreadsheet to something all the way to as exotic of this special program that produced a risk matrix, and that was accepted by the POI also. So there's a lot of ways to do this, and that's the beauty of safety risk management. It's a performance-based process and rule. So the way that you do it is kind of up to you and the process and stuff, with certain boundaries and certain things needed to be looked at. This particular example of a risk assessment on these 2 particular exemptions are pretty straightforward because it is already spelled out what the hazard is itself. And so once you identify the hazard, which sometimes can be very complex and very misleading when trying to do that, that's why understanding the system, which is basically the certificate holder system, and the process and procedure you already have in place, that's why it's really, really important. So, okay, Jackie, thank you.
Thank you, Keith. All right, let's see if we have, let me pop up this next slide here. If you have additional questions, do feel free to email John or Keith. I don't have my email address up there, I realized. Mine is jrosser@outlook.com. Feel free to email any of us. We will do our best to get you the information you need, especially, as John indicated, if there is a problem, if you're not getting the response from your POI, if you're having difficulty, please let us know. We'd be happy to help you out with that. We can do some questions. We have time for that. If anybody would like to either raise their hand or type in a question, we'll give a minute here for you guys to do that, and then we will move forward. And Keith, while we're waiting, can you addressed it a little bit, but is there an opportunity, do you know how many, are you getting a feel for the operators, or John, even from the FAA at headquarters standpoint, how many of them have already put through on this? Have they gotten a good feedback with their POIs? Are POIs prepared to work with them on this?
Yeah, I can answer that. So in talking to FAA at headquarters, they haven't had anybody report that the POI, that they had difficulty getting this approved for the POI. And I think the message they gave POIs is it's really the bulk of the responsibility is on the operator to assess the risk. So there should be a fairly light touch on this one. I think in the some of the other mitigations that we'll see in the upcoming SFAR may require a little more work, a little more complex version of this, but they think the POIs are accepting it, and that's why it's important for us to know if the POIs aren't, so we can give them that feedback, because they can't fix what they don't know about.
Okay, you have a couple questions that have come in. Oh, go ahead, Keith.
So what I would really like to just drive home is the dealings that I've had with the operators. My advice to them: don't ask the question. Don't say, how do you want this? Because what we found is the POIs, I mean, they're great people. They do a great job for the flying public. The problem is they have not been formally trained on SMS, safety risk management. So that's the reason we're seeing the acceptance of a multitude of things. That's why the advice I gave to the operators that's already got their POI to approve it. This is our process. This was what we've identified as a hazard. This is a risk. This is a mitigation strategy we put into place. Oh, by the way, here's the letters that document a temporary process of managing crew. This is what we're going to do. Everything is laid out. Those are the ones that there is no issue. It's accepted on the spot because it's very well laid out. It's very well thought out, and it's the operator that's doing it. So that would be my advice. Don't ask the question, go, this is our process. This is how we've come to hazard. This is how we've come to a risk. And this is our mitigation strategy to comply with 135.329. So.
Okay, let's go ahead and address our first question. If the crew is due in April with May as the grace, would you still have 90 days past May, or is it 90 days past April? I believe, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, it's an additional 2 months on the 1 month.
Yes. Yes. So that's the reason they specify May of 2020. Any crew members that's going to require training are coming up due training up to that point. So I don't think it's going to be an excess, but if they're due in May, then they have an additional month after that. It's built into the regulatory wording, right?
Okay. And the next question deals with 135.331. And is there any grace period extension to the requirements of 331, specifically the emergency drills? The exemption 18509 allows exemption from using O2 masks.
But I think that's part of the training also. So the mitigation for that would be maybe you have them run through it as temporary without donning the PBE. I think that's the crux of when you say that, John.
Yeah, I think you're right, Keith. The intent was, it's real important in these exemptions to look at the footnotes, because they cover the footnotes are where they chose to put all of the stuff that is covered. Their intention was to extend all of this training and provide relief from having to don oxygen masks, that sort of thing. So the intent was to delay it. I think I do think this is included in those extensions.
Okay, and then we had a question about, does this apply only to flight training or knowledge-based training like the TSA 12.5 training? We did actually inquire with the TSA. These exemptions are purely for FAA. We did have some questions, and we put that to TSA, and TSA had responded back to us that because they don't require in-classroom, in-person training, they do have provisions for remote training, that they at this time have not looked into providing any kind of relief from your security program training. Okay. John, this might be directed more to you. I think you had typed the answer in, but just in case somebody's not reading the text there, the question on what happens if we are not back to quote unquote normal by the end of the 2 months extension.
Yeah, so just mechanically, it's very easy for the FAA, once they've made a decision that they can extend a requirement through an exemption or through rulemaking, it's relatively straightforward to say we need more time. The caveat is, over time, the theory is the system is safe today and it won't be unsafe tomorrow, but over time that risk will increase, right? As you drift further and further from having required training and checking and all that is in place to keep the system safe. there's an increased risk. So on the one hand, the FAA is aware that if this drags out, they're going to have to do something to extend it. I think there's the potential that they could start taking a closer look at specific elements that might introduce more risk and try to find maybe ways to do something remote or somehow better mitigate that risk. But the answer is yes. The FAA chose this interval because you have to pick a time frame, and if you go too far, it's very difficult to get agreement inside government that it's a good idea, because nobody wants to signal that this thing's going to last much longer. So they chose an interval similar to what has been done when we have hurricanes and have to provide relief. They chose an interval that seemed to be reasonable, but they're aware if this drags out, things might have to be extended.
Thanks, John. Let's see, we do have one operator online that is reporting they haven't heard back from their POI yet. And they are a small pilot group. They do not have an SMS yet. And the question is, can this be done as simply as having crew self-certify proficiency and advising the chief pilot if something changes?
I would ask the question.
Would you say they have to have a more... Yeah.
I mean, I will tell you, in a previous life, I would have asked for more than self-certification. I would have asked for, because they're being observed, and, that is a level set, because flying the line, people sometimes they pick up tendencies that, level setting is a good thing. Self-certification, so the question, if I was sitting across the table from the operator, I would ask the question like, has there been any issues? Has there been any reports? Has there been any infraction of rules, busting airspeed, altitude, unstabilized approach? There'd be a whole litany of things that I would ask to get through to that mitigation. So it could be as a briefing to the affected individuals that, hey, look, these are some of the things, and just have a general conversation, if that's practical. I'm kind of making all this stuff up on the fly, but that would, sitting across the table, that's one of the things that I would ask.
Yeah, I agree with you, Keith. I think that the FAA is looking to the operator to make sure that they're continuing to mitigate those risks. And just saying that let me know if anything's wrong is it sounds like a pretty hands-off approach to it. I would probably try to do something a little more than that, but we'd have to get into the particulars of your system to see how that would work and how many people are involved and what kind of flying you're doing and all those things. But they clearly would want you to know, as an operator, the health of and safety of your system.
Good point.
Next question is that the email address where you send your letter of intent is going to AFS 200, and just from a process standpoint, our operators, should they expect a response back from AFS 200 or just from their POI?
Well, there's really a couple of steps. Go ahead, John.
No, go ahead, Keith. Go ahead. That's fine.
So the intent is those letters of intent are actually being filed with a docket, and you can see those online. There's a very specific place to go. Very straightforward, but that's two completely different things. You're still going to have to work with the POI. So what I would do, if it was me, what I would do is when I sent that document via email, I would CC the POI in that. That's my intent. And then you can start having a substantive conversation directly with the POI around what it's going to take to get a 005 amended. What's the hazard identification, risk assessment, and mitigation strategies that particular operator are going to put into place. I would also put that in a letter. It could be in a letter, it could be in an email, just to say, and then, basically when could I expect relief on this? Present the required documents. But those two separate things, and I don't believe that 200 is talking to every individual 135 POI. So I would make it the joint thing.
Yeah, great advice, Keith. Your best bet is to keep the POI in the loop on all of this. It is two separate things. 200 is trying to make sure that the conditions of the exemption are met, and part of that is by including these letters in the docket. The POI is directly responsible, trying to get your OPSPEC signed. So keep both of them in the loop. If you get an extended delay, or you can't get a hold of your POI or something like that happens, let us know. And we're not trying to get anybody in trouble. I know these guys in the field are trying to make things work remotely as well. But we'll be glad to highlight it so they can get some attention focused on it.
So is the expectation from the next question here, once your A005 is signed and issued to you by your POI, are you good to go on the exemption?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, Keith.
Yeah.
That could be a trick question, because I was working with one operator. That said, "Hey, look, I'm going to send you this," and the A005 got amended without any evidentiary support for, I've done this and this is my strategy, this is my way forward on this. So what I would say is, for your own protection, give them that information. This is how we're going to do it, and then through WebOps they can update to A005. But that is a condition and limitation, and that if the onus is on the operator to provide those conditions and limitations. And if you don't do it, I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So
yeah, I was going to say my phrase that comes to mind is, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get me. So if you have your A005, your inspector may issue that, they may put that out for you, but you are the one using this exemption. You, the operator, are responsible for making sure you comply with all the conditions and limitations. So on the one hand, yes, you've got the OPSPEC. That's like the final piece you need from the FAA, but you still have the obligation to do everything else that's listed there. All right, so somebody is asking, just for clarification, the exemption applies to those with a base month then in February, March, or April. Meaning somebody who was due for training in January already should have been retrained.
Should have been.
And now falls into maybe the April category there. So anybody who was in February, March, April is coming due in this time period. Does that sound right?
It does. Anybody that comes due from when the exemption came out to May the 31st. So what this exemption gives is 2-month extension, and you add the 1-month grace period already on there, so you really get 3. But the period is to May the 31st, and John made a great point. You don't want to put it out way too far, because then you kind of lose track of what's really going on. They can always extend that, but between now and May the 31st.
And the next question is, what should you do if your letter of intent is not showing up on regulations.gov? I would suspect there's going to be a lag. Don't assume that it hasn't been submitted. You've sent it. Keep track of your sent items and when you sent that off. But there's always a lag between when you submit a document into a docket and when it actually appears on the public side of that. But I would also put that with the previous advice to make sure you're copying and looping your POI in on the process. It actually appearing in the docket isn't something for you to worry about. That's the FAA's mechanism for tracking all of this. But you being in contact with your POI to move forward on it is the important part. They will all eventually appear in regulations.gov.
Yep.
Oh, here's a good question. If the base month is in March and they are now not checked until June, does it reset their base month to June, or does it revert back to March? In other words, do we reset the clock when we next conduct a training, it sounds like?
That's a great question. I can't remember now what we did. Because the basis for all this is other natural disasters we've dealt with. This one is obviously has a lot of different elements with the, with the distancing and all. But I don't think we reset it. I think we, in the past, kept it all the same. Keith, do you remember if we reset or kept it the same?
I think the original due date stayed the same because we got into this. Even though they're going to get training, that training should have taken place, say, in March, but they don't get it till June. I don't think that gives them an additional 3 months. I mean, they were on the exemption, so the original due date is still in effect. I think that's what we've done in the past.
Yeah, I think you're right, Keith. We can raise that question with FAA to confirm, and keep an eye on our Corona resource page, COVID resource page, I guess we're calling it anyway, for any updated information if they publish something on it.
Okay, we'll go with I think let me check here on the list of questions. And the next one, I think, Keith, there was somebody who picked up on what you said and wanted some more information. Did I hear correctly? The FAA may move toward requiring a formal SMS program from Part 135 operators in the future.
I do believe that is going to move forward. I know there is some initial discussion around rulemaking for that. So a couple of months ago, there was a lot of discussion around, formal SMSs for 135 operators. John, do you have additional?
Yeah, I think, Keith, I think you're right. Eventually, this is going to happen. In 135 is on the most wanted list for NTSB primarily because they want to see things like SMS in place. They also want to see recorders and other things, but that adds some focus. I think if you look at the congressional response to the 737 MAX, they're very focused on SMS as well. When it happens is very difficult with obviously this is going to interrupt any agenda that was in place, the virus event. But I think it's inevitable. Eventually, everybody will have to adopt. I will tell you, NATA is having discussions with FAA, and Keith is leading that effort about the need to have very scalable SMS systems, things that work for small operators as well, and ways to make it a little easier to implement. So we're trying to find ways to make it more practical and easier to implement in anticipation of the rulemaking when it eventually does come out.
And guys, we have a sharp-eyed reader of the exemptions, and all of the good information is indeed found in the footnotes. The base month question resetting is addressed on page 4 in the footnote, and it says with a 2-month extension, if your grace months were June, July, and August, if you complete your training in June through August, the crew member will have been considered to complete it in May. So you keep the original month.
Yep.
Which is what you guys thought it would be. So yes, the footnotes are where all the good information is in this. There was a question about flight safety or semi-flight, the training centers shutting down. Have either of you heard anything in particular about that right now?
Well, let me just say there's always a concern, right? I mean, as we try to manage this and figure out alternate ways to get things done, there's always a concern that they might have to. Right now, they're not, that I've heard, and they're looking at taking advantage of some of the flexibility that is in the exemptions, and then in the upcoming SFAR, I think they will address even more of that. But right now we're okay.
So, Jackie, may I?
Yes.
So one of the things, around the SMS rule and for 135 operators, right now, a conservative number of 135 operators that have an FAA accepted safety management system, conservative numbers around 10. And those are some of the larger 135 operations. So that kind of gives you the scope of movement on this. But I would say there's going to be a concerted effort. As soon as we get through this pandemic, there's going to be a concerted effort to do that. It took about, what do you think, John, 6 years, 5 or 6 years to get to a rule for 121. So that kind of gives you a sense of about how long it takes.
Yeah, and that's right, Keith. And that was when it really officially kicked off, and it took that long. So I think,
right.
Although we've learned a lot since then, I still think it's going to be a protracted effort to get it in place. I want to bring up one of our attendees said some of the programs have been shut down at flight safety, some recurrent and initials for the Challenger. So we know there are some programs being shut down.
Yeah, I have a response here from somebody. I believe it is Tucson. Looks like some of the Flight Safety International in Tucson has canceled some recurrent and initial for Challenger.
Mm-hmm.
I think the initials, and actually there's another question that just popped in here. A pilot is in need of a 299, and with the FAA not doing in-person checks, how can I get this candidate to act as POI on our aircraft? And I think, as we had talked before, the FAA is focused on people who are already current and qualified, and then allowing them to stay in operations versus, not having a priority on doing any initial checks. But John, have you heard anything different from the FAA on how, if this does continue to go, what we'll do as far as it adding? And then I know they've kind of put a halt on adding new aircraft to certificates. Is there any further discussion in how we'll handle that going forward, or once we do start back up, how we'll handle the backlog?
Yeah, so the FAA understands the issue. I mean, they know this is a problem, and they're trying to figure out ways to address it. And all I can tell you, we don't know specifically how they're going to address it, or whether they'll be able to address every single request. But this has been on the list from us for since the beginning. So we'll just have to wait and see. When they're not going to do a comment period on the SFAR, because that would delay it for a lot longer than it would be worth. But they are saying, look, we'll get this SFAR out. And again, if there are cases, if there's something we missed or something we couldn't accommodate broadly, let us know, and we'll see what we can do. And in some cases, there may be ways to use other people for the checks or something that they'll allow. So again, this is all unfolding, as every hour something's changing. So I do think that they're aware of it, they're working it, and we'll just have to see what comes out.
All right, well, we are just about out of time, and I haven't seen any other questions pop up, so we will go ahead and wrap up for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar recording will be posted to the NATA coronavirus website. Probably next week, they'll be able to get it all processed and posted. And if you want to take one more chance, if you haven't yet, to download the 2 attachments if you need them, you can do that. If you have any problems, again, please email us. Keep your eye on the NATA coronavirus website as well. There are a lot of resources on there that are available to everyone, regardless of your membership with NATA. It's just a resource for anybody to be able to take advantage of. And I thank you all for joining us today. And that concludes our webinar. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie.